Hey viewers, tonight we start with the peculiar, occasionally gruesome, and unintentionally hilarious world of medieval medicine, a time when most doctors were 1 part scholar, 2 parts guesswork, and 3 parts confidence in a very large robe. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Not because you passed a test, not because you trained under an expert, and have a Latin book that you sort of skimmed once during a thunderstorm. You wake up in your timber-framed home just before sunrise. The air smells like damp straw, candle wax, and the vague regret of last night's onion stew. Your mattress is little more than lumpy hay in a bag. You're 30, which, in this era, means you're respected, seasoned, and one surprise infection away from retirement. You stretch, cough politely into a cloth, and prepare for a full day of healing. A term you use loosely. I don't own a stethoscope. It hasn't been invented. You don't use soap either. You trust the antiseptic power of incense and judgmental glares. No official credentials hang on your wall, but no one asks. After all, you speak Latin, own for entire books, and on Sedecler, a man cured after he vomited. In 4 directions, you're basically a miracle worker. You dress carefully, long woolen robes to show you're educated, and a big hat to hide the fact that you don't know what's causing off boils. You sling your medical bag over your shoulder. It's filled with knives, dried herbs, and the faint hope that no one asks you to explain how kidneys work. Today, like most days, you'll inspect urine, declare people humorally imbalanced, and maybe drain a pint of blood from someone with a toothache. You're not worried. You've done this dozens of times, probably. And if things go badly, you have your fallback excuses. Bad air, sinful behavior, or Mars being in the wrong house again. Worst case, you recommend prayer and back away slowly. You finish your bread, take a sip of weak ale, safer than the water, and step outside. You're not just a man. You are a healer, a scholar, and absolutely no one needs to know that you once treated a stomachache with masajarlic and pigeon feathers. Your secret is safe for now. Your day begins, as all great medical careers do, with a goblet of warm pee. Not yours, of course. That would be weird. This one belongs to your first patient, who had the courtesy to deliver it in a clay jar shortly after sunrise. It's still warm. Freshness matters in your line of work. You eaten the table like a fine wine and hold it up to the light. What little light you have streaming through your tiny smoke-stained window, you swirl it gently, inhale deeply, and make a thoughtful sound with your mouth that says, "Ah yes, this man is clearly suffering from excess phlegm, and also possibly envy." Welcome to uroscopy, the medieval art of diagnosing illness by examining urine, its color, clarity, scent, thickness. And, yes, occasionally, taste are the primary diagnostic tools in your arsenal. Forget stethoscopes. Forget thermometers. You've got 16 shades of yellow, a vague chart from a monastery in Flanders, and an instinct honed by years of pretending to know what you're doing. Clear and pale. That's good. Deep orange. Liver trouble. Murky. Brown. Probably hot bile or punishment from Mars. Blue. Witchcraft. Definitely witchcraft. If your patient's urine has bubbles in it, that might mean they're about to die. If it doesn't, you might still tell them they're about to die, just to be safe. After all, people appreciate honesty. You might even warm the sample with a candle to wake up the humors, a bit like microwaving soup before serving it. You then record your findings on a little wax tablet and scribble something vaguely Latin, Theteven, you'll struggle to read later. And when your patient nervously asks what's wrong, you nod wisely, point at the jar. Avoid figs, loud noises, and a woman named Agnes. You hand them a pouch of herbs, a small talisman, and possibly a leech, and send them on their way, feeling both confused and vaguely reassured, because, in the end, what matters isn't curing them. It sounds like you could if you really wanted to. As a medieval doctor, you don't ask your patient if they've been sleeping, eating properly, or exposed to moldy bread. No, you ask the real questions, like, how often have you been visited by black bile this week? Because everyone knows your body is controlled by 4 sacred fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It's not about bacteria or viruses or nutrition. That's the future. Nonsense. The human body is basically a boiling cauldron of wet medieval soup, and your job is to make sure none of the ingredients are winning. Let's say your patient is angry and flushed. Clearly too much blood. The cure. You take some of it out. They're tired and pale. That's excess phlegm, probably from eating cold foods or talking to someone with low moral character. Yellow bile means thire, irritable, and vomit. Black bile, that one covers just about everything else, including nightmares, melancholia, and poetry. Your entire medical strategy is just advanced plumbing with a moral edge. You adjust the humors with diet, herbs, enemas, vomiting, bleeding, or, ideally, all of the above. If the body is shot and moist, you recommend cold and dry food, because the answer to is clearly more imbalance, but in the opposite direction. Your patient doesn't need logic. They need sage, boiled in goat milk while facing east. Of course, no 2 doctors agree on exactly how much bile is too much, but that's fine. Disagreement makes you sound deeper. You use phrases like humoral disc and temperamental flux to cover any gaps in knowledge, though the important thing is to look serene while they panic. And if they die, well, it wasn't your fault. It was their phlegm, or perhaps Saturn, or that sinful lifestyle they lead before asking you for help. Either way, you retain your dignity, because in medieval medicine, the humors must be obeyed, even if no one, including you, fully understands what they are doing. It's not about healing, it's about balance, and sounding impressive while recommending mustard plasters for a broken rib. As a medieval doctor, you believe in balance, specifically the balance of humors. And when things feel off, say your patient has a fever, or a headache, or a bad dream involving pigs, there's only one solution: let the blood out. You don't need a diagnosis. You need a bowl, a blade, and the courage to act before breakfast. The idea is simple. Blood is hot and moist. If someone is too hot, or too moist, or just mildly annoying, a little drainage brings them back to harmony or unconsciousness. Either way, your work is done. You might open a vein in the arm or behind Dechny if you're feeling fancy. The neck is reserved for serious cases or especially dramatic flair. And don't worry, you've got a chart from a 12th century monk that tells you which vein corresponds with which organ. It's probably right. He seemed confident. Your patient lies down, arm extended, face pale, though that might just be anticipatory regret. You tie a tight cloth to make the veins swell, say something Latin to sound learnt, and make the cut. The blood begins to flow. You nod solemnly. Your assistant faints. You collect the blood in a ceramic bowl. There's no set amount, just enough for the patient to stop complaining or start wobbling. Some doctors claim they can read the illness in the blood's thickness or smell. You mostly pretend you can too. Occasionally, you swap Theblade for a leech if you want something more hands-free and significantly more wriggly. Leeches are quiet, reusable, and always hungry. They're also excellent listeners. When it's over, you wrap the arm, offer some weak ale, and advise rest, not too much, though sloth increases phlegm. If the patient walks away, you declare them improved. If they passed out, successfully purged. If they die, it's too late to treat. Because in your world, bloodletting isn't just a cure, it's a lifestyle, and you haven't even had your turnip porridge yet. You finish your morning bloodletting routine, wipe your hands on your robe or the nearest apprentice, and prepare for the day's real opportunity, house calls. Specifically, the homes of those who can't afford things like walls, servants, and not dying. Peasants are fine for practice, but they tend to pay in chickens, labor, or a tearful thank you. Noble families, on the other hand, pay in coin, compliments, and occasionally awkward invitations to dinner where someone is visibly dying at the table. You pack your bag, leeches, ointments, sores, and a collection of dried herbs that all smell vaguely of hay and sadness. You make sure your hat is taloned. Your robe is heavy. This isn't just about healing, it's about presence. Up Panerival at the manor. You're greeted by a servant who clearly distrusts you but says nothing because you're wearing velvet and carrying a bag of knives. The air smells like beeswax, damp stone, and boiled something. A woman faints in the hallway. No one mentions it. Your patient is lying in a fur-poster bed, surrounded by tapestries and anxious relatives. They've got a fever, a swollen foot. Usual questions. What have they eaten? How often have they bathed? Never. Has Mercury recently crossed paths with Saturn? Then you look wisely into the fire for a full 5 seconds before announcing it's an imbalance of the humors, probably bile. You recommend something authoritative, a mush of crushed mint and powdered snail shell. Perhaps you tell them to avoid cold wind, red meat, or thinking too hard. You prescribe bed rest, which they're already doing spectacularly. Before you leave, Thelody of the house presses coins into your hand, hoping you're worth more than the priest who came by last week and just sprinkled everything with holy water and left. You nod solemnly, promise to return, and remind them, if swelling moves upward, send for you immediately. If it moves downward, send for the priest. You call it a medical bag. Everyone else calls it a reason tovli. Your satchel is heavy, not with hope or healing, but with an alarming collection of objects that wouldn't look out of place in a dungeon. And yet, this is your daily carry, your medieval doctor's kit, your pride and joy, your portable cabinet of please hold still. You open it up before each visit, like a magician revealing his tricks. Inside, a terrifying blend of sharp, rusty, vaguely holy, and deeply unhygienic. First, your knives. Not scalpels, just honest-to-God knives. Sharp enough to open skin, not sharp enough to inspire confidence. One is for cutting, one is for draining, and one you use to spread soft cheese during lunch. They all look the same. Then there are the hooks for pulling out infected teeth or dislodging things that aren't supposed to be there. You've got saws for amputations, cautery irons for closing wounds with fire, and a tree-panning skull when someone gets a head thoughts, clearly the result of spirits trapped in the brain. You carry leeches, of course, stored in a small jar, wriggling with enthusiasm. Each one has a name. You try not to get attached. In a smaller pouch, you keep your ointments and powders, crushed herbs, dried lizard tails, ground antler, maybe some questionable stones. Someone swore it cured stomach ailments. You haven't bothered labeling anything. It's more fun, Togus. There's also a urine flask used for diagnosis, and sometimes as a paperweight when the wind picks up your notes. And let's not forget the astrological wheel for determining whether Venus is ruining your patient's spleen. Bandages, rare soap, theoretical, clean water. You wrap it all in a cloth that hasn't been washed since the last plague, and hope, no. One asks why the blade has dried blood on it. Relic of Saint Sebastian, you explain. They nod in reverence. You both move on, and somehow this bag, this terrifying, clanging, possibly cursed object, give us your authority. You walk into a room, open it, and people assume you know exactly what you're doing, which, in a way, you do. You walk into the sick room, take one look at the pail. You're not just a doctor. You're a celestial cartographer of human suffering. And in your world, no diagnosis is complete without confirming whether Saturn is in opposition or if Jupiter is being particularly. You reach for your trusty zodiac chart, covered in symbols that would terrify a modern science teacher, and everything in between is divinately across the horoscope, like a medieval game board. The patient's stomach hurts, and the moon is in Virgo. That's clearly a bad omen. Not for you, for them. You nod, slowly, dramatically. The patient watches wide-eyed as you mutter about Mercury retrograding near their liver. The stars, you explain, control the flow of humors in the body. Mars causes fevers. Saturn cows melancholy. Venus, that one, causes inappropriate swelling and awkward family drama. Timing matters. You wouldn't dare perform bloodletting while the moon is waxing. Everyone knows stats, how you get spontaneous fainting and marital problems. And God forbid, someone gives birth during a solar eclipse. After all, it sounds smart, and it gives them something vague to blame their ailments on. Birth hour, rising. Sin, position of the moon, when they first sneezed 3 days ago. All crucial data points in determining their shoulder is full of hot bile. And when your diagnosis is complete, you deliver it with reverence. Your phlegm ishivi, because Venus is damp this week. No one knows what that means, least of all you. But they nod, they pay, they thank you for your insight. And off you go, celestial wizard of the leeches, ready to heal more souls with nothing but a compass, a candle, and the misplaced trust of the ill. You're a buto, cut a man open with a knife you also use to slice cheese. Everything is going to be just fine. It's surgery day, not because the moon is right or the patient's humors are calm, but because the swelling has started to smell like cooked onions, and someone finally screamed loud enough to get your attention. You lay out your tools, a dull knife, a bone saw, a rag soaked in wine, and something vaguely shaped like hookerage. There is no anesthesia. The patient gets two things, a cup o' fail, and the advice to bite something wooden and think about nice memories. You reassure him with a warm smile and a phrase like, "This may sting a little." It won't. It will sting a lot. You'll begin cutting. There's yelling. There's shaking. At some point, someone passes out. Hopefully, it's not you. You're the assistant. Holds the patient down while also looking like he'd rather be apprenticing to a baker or a corpse. You might remove infected flesh, drain some mysterious pus, or yank out a rotten tooth with something that looks like garden shears. You're not too worried about germs. You don't now they exist. You believe infection comes from bad air. Either way, your tools haven't been cleaned since the last procedure, which was on a goat. Maybe you didn't ask. Once the job is done, you pour Winnie in the wound for cleansing and theatrics, then seal it with hot iron or spiderweb soaked in oil, both of which are medically questionable but sound impressive. You wrap it in linen and tell the patient to rest. And Iphenone criticizes your work. You point out that Galen once removed a gladiator's spleen with a bronze hook, and he is still considered a genius. Because, in your world, surgery isn't about success. It's about confidence, speed, and the patient screaming slightly less than usual. When in doubt, slap a leech on it, or several, or a dozen, depending on how serious you want to look. You've tried prayers. You've even tried slicing into people with the delicacy of abucha on market day. But nothing screams professional medicine quite like applying live worms to a human body. Leeches are your go-to remedy, the Swiss Army knife of medieval healthcare. Fever, leech. Headache, leech. Swollen ankle, broken heart, mysterious ghost-related, trembling, leech, leech, and leech. You carry them in a small jar, or as you call it, desk-worming chalice of miracles. They see a slimy black worm and assume you're mad, but you assureth them this is a refined and ancient practice used by learnt men in fine robes. You don't mention that some Aftos men were monks, guessing wildly, or barbers, just trying to distract clients from the smell of boiled socks. Uselect, a healthy-looking leech, plump, energetic, and eager for blood, like a tiny Gothic vampire. You apply it to the skin, often behind the ear, or on a veiny bit of forearm, and wait. If it latches him quickly, you smile and say, "Ah yes." The leech agrees with your imbalance. If it doesn't, you mutter something about Mercury being in retrograde and try again. Soon, the leech swells with blood. Your patient turns pale. You pretend this is entirely normal. You say things like, "He's drawing out the toxins," or "Your bile was misbehaving," or, if you're feeling cruel, you just let it drop off on its own, dramatically bloated and deeply satisfied. The patient, dizzy and concerned, asks if they're cured. You say, "We've taken a promising first step." Translation, you have no idea, but the leech looks pleased. And sometimes that's enough to keep everyone believing in the magic, because, in the end, the best thing about leeches is that they do all the work, and they never ask for payment. As a medieval doctor, your understanding of the human mind is, let's say, interpretive. What you do have is a solid belief that if someone's behavior is unusual, it's either sinful, supernatural, or both. Your first patient of the day is a woman who hasn't spoken in 2 weeks. She stares at walls, occasionally hums, and dances through a spoon at her husband's cousin. In your book, this can only mean thing, possessed by spirits, possibly plural. Ask the priest if he's available. Sprinkle some holy water, and light a candle that smells vaguely of despair and goat fat. Then, with the utmost seriousness, you tell her family that she's been overtaken by melancholy caused by annexus of black bile or a minor demon named Gregory. Of course, melancholia isiar kachal, diagnosis for sadness, anxiety, introversion, poetry, and any woman who reads too much. Your treatment options include herbal compresses, bleeding, forced prayer, or, if things get really spicy, an exorcism. For the truly mad, there's always the monasterier, the local madhouse, which is just a glorified barn with a padlock and some hay. Their patients are often treated with cold baths, whipping, and shouted scripture. The theory is simple. If their mind is broken, scare it back into place. Some doctors dabble in trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to release the spirits. You haven't tried it yourself, but you nod respectfully when others mention it. Bold move. Women, of course, get special attention. You recommend calming herbs, a cold compress, and for her to stop thinking so much, possibly marriage, possibly a pilgrimage. If the patient improves, divine blessing. If they don't, God's will. Either way, your conscience is clear. Because in your profession, mental illness isn't a condition, it's a cosmic inconvenience. And your job isn't to understand it, it's to survive it without catching it. You strut into town with your tall, hated your Latin phrases, fresh from draining a nobleman's elbow. You air without a doubt the smartest man alive, or at least within walking distance. Button, disaster strikes. Your patient is also seeing an apothecary. How dareth thee? Apothecaries are the medieval equivalent of pharmacists, but with Morrises and fewer regulations. They grind herbs, boil roots, mix mysterious pastes, and somehow actually help people, which is frankly infuriating. They don't quote Aristotle. They don't carry charts of planetary alignment. They just hand out medicine that smells like regret and actually does something. You, however, are a university-trained physician, or at least you own a book that says so. You don't stoop to like measuring powders or boiling bark. Your job is to point at the stars, talk about bile, and prescribe vague ideas. Let the apothecary figure out what a cooling tonic with lunar influence even means. Still, patients soften, trust them. After all, apothecaries live in town, know everyone's secrets, and haven't accidentally bled someone to death this week. Their shops smell of thyme and honey, not singed bandages and clove oil despair. The rivalry is fierce. You think they're meddling herbalists. They think you're an overpaid slob with a gut complex. You accuse them of poisoning the sick with folk remedies. They accuse you of charging for silver coins to mutter. Your spleen is rebellious. Sometimes you team up begrudgingly. A treatment so vague it's basically a vibe, and they concoct something that might help but definitely won't kill. If the patient recovers, you take the credit. If not, you quietly imply the apothecary didn't boil the mandrake root long enough. Of course, neither of you truly wins. The patient tends up poorer. The town gets another health rumor, and the local priest claims it was divine intervention. A la long, but at least you maintained your dignity. Because in medieval medicine, you don't need to be effective. You just need to be louder, richer, and slightly more terrifying than your competition. You don't need to know how plants work, just which ones make patients slightly less loud. You're a medieval doctor, which means you are an expert in herbs by default, mostly because everyone assumes you are. After all, you own a book with faded ink drawings of plants, some dried leaves in a pouch, and the confidence of a man who once told Simon to eat sage for a leg wound. Today's patient arrives with an issue described as inner churning, which could mean stomach cramps, heartbreak, or possibly demonic influence. You rummage through your sack of mystery flora and decide confidently that valerian root should do the trick. Why? Because it's small, strong, and makes people sleepy. Two reliable signs that it's doing something. You also keep a stash of which you prescribe for digestion, fleas, and people who annoy you. There's nettle for pain, mallow for inflammation, and a mandra, which you only use when you want to look mysterious. It's mildly poisonous, wildly expensive, and vaguely shaped like a person. Perfect for impressing the illiterate. The truth is, you don't really know what each herb does, and neither does anyone else. You go by tradition, vague anecdotes, and whatever the monk down the road swears cured his cousin's goat. You grind, boil, and mash with enthusiasm, all while reciting Latin words to make it feel official. Sometimes you add honey, not for medicinal reasons, just because everything tastes like wet soil otherwise. And patients complain less when their spleen tonic doesn't taste like punishment. If the remedy works, you nod solemnly and say, "The fever has sealed it to the herb's cool nature." If it doesn't, you blame the patient for not believing hard enough. And when desperate, you mix several herbs together and pray one of them cancels out the others. It's a bit like gambling, but with more vomiting. You also insist on foraging your own ingredients when possible, because wild herbs are clearly stronger, or at least dirtier, which adds to the rustic charm. In the end, your herbal cures are 30% tradition, 20% guesswork, and 50% bluffing. But hey, at least they don't scream when you hand them a cup of tea, no matter how much leeching, bleeding, or herb mashing you do. You are never truly alone in your medical career, because the church is always lurking like a very concerned parent, or a nosy neighbor who just happens to control your entire worldview and political structure. Your patient has a fever. You can try a pus, but first you should probably check if they've confessed their sins. Coughing up blood sounds like divine punishment. Best send for the priest before you even think about opening your apothecary pack. Healing is fine as long as you don't outshine God. You've been warned before that one time you cured a nobleman's gout with vinegar and hot rocks. People said it bordered on sorcery. That time you suggested the stars might influence digestion heresy adjacent. And when you briefly considered experimenting with cadaver dissection, you might as well have suggested talking to trees. Of course, the church has its own ideas about healing, namely prayer, relics, and occasionally touching bones wrapped in gold. You don't argue. You just sigh quietly and make room for the priest to sprinkle holy water on your patient while you stand there holding a jar of mashed garlic and shame. Sometimes you even team up. You provide the earthly treatment, and the priest provides the heavenly reassurance. If the patient gets better, it's a miracle. If they don't, well, God's mysterious will, and maybe you need more incense. You've learnt to work around it. You begin your treatments with a quick "May God guide my blade," and end with a firm "Amen" just in case someone's listening. You also keep a small crucifix in your bag, not for healing, but for warding off suspicion when someone accuses you of thinking too much. You are, after all, a man of science. A vague, squishy, blood-soaked version of science, but still just not the kind that questions the church. If the limb is rotting, infected, or just generally upsetting to look at, why not remove it? It's the medieval way. You've bled, you've purged, and you've leached. You even tried praying near the patient while waving a handful of times, and still, the leg looks worse than a loaf of bread left in the rain for 3 weeks. That's when you know it's time to amputate. You don't take this decision lightly, mostly because it's heavy work and you skipped breakfast. But when the wound is black, the smell is unnatural, and the patient's groans have turned into ominous silence, you sharpen the saw. The setup is simple. You find the patient a sturdy table and a strong friend to hold them down. An assistant fetches the amputation kit: one saw, one tourniquet, one rag to bite, and one large jug of fale for medicinal purposes. Not for the patient, for you. You explain the procedure gently, using words like necessary, heroic, and possibly survival. The patient turns pale. You nod understandingly. You would be nervous too, if someone with your level of training were coming at your thigh with a glorified bread knife. You tie the tourniquet tight, say something about balance and humors just for show, and start cutting slowly at first, then with increasing urgency once the screaming hits full volume. The saw bites through skin, fat, muscle, and eventually bone. You pretend not to know. You're a professional. Once it's off, you toss the limb into a nearby bucket and immediately cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron. The smell is unforgettable. You blame the candle wax, then comes bandaging. You wrap the wound tightly with linen and a silent hope that infection won't set in by sundown. You advise the patient to rest, avoid cold wind, and, if possible, not die. If these survive, you are a miracle worker. If they don't, you solemnly declare fat's corruption had spread to the soul. In truth, it's a brutal procedure, but sometimes amputation is the only way to save a life, or at least slightly delay while maintaining your professional reputation. You hear coughing in the distance. Tomato, go home and pretend you didn't. It's been a long day. You've drained blood, argued with apothecaries, applied leeches to at least 3 confused people, and removes one leg with the grace of a drunken carpenter. You're ready to call it a night. But then you hear it, a rattle, a wheeze, a cough that sounds like it crawled out of the underworld. You freeze. Your apprentice freezes. Even the leeches seem tense. There's only one possible explanation. The plague is back. You've seen it before. You remember the last time it swept. Your barber-surgeon friend left town in a wagon, and your favorite baker simply stopped existing. You reach for your mask, not because it works, but because it makes you feel better. It's filled with dried flowers, vinegar-soaked cloth, and misplaced confidence. You don't understand disease transmission, but you do understand that if the sick people come too close, you mysteriously stop being a doctor. You pack your tools quickly. There's no time for farewells. You mutter something about lunar interference and fasting, as you back away from the village. The thing is, medieval medicine has no real answer for plague. You can't bleed it out. You can't push it. And you definitely can't chant it into submission. Your treatments range from burning herbs to light entire neighborhoods on fire. One of those occasionally works. You consider writing down your findings, but decide against it. You'd rather not be remembered for suggesting garlic water as a cure. Fourth, end of humanity. Instead, you head for the countryside. Maybe visit a monastery. Maybe take up winemaking. Anything that doesn't involve open sore sand. Deeply suspicious groaning. Because, as a medieval doctor, you know when to treat, and more importantly, you know when to disappear. The leeches wriggle in agreement. The stars say it's time. And your robe smells like burnt basil and regret. You vanish into the mist like a medical magician with no answers. And the townsfolk, they'll say he did everything he could, which is technically true. He just did it from far away. Imagine walking into a grand medieval cathedral. Stone columns rise like trees. Incense fills the air, and stained glass windows scatter divine light across the pews. Normally, you'd expect solemn monks chanting Latin prayers and bishops draped in regal vestments, but not today. Today, there's a man up front in a bishop's mitre, and he's drunk. His robes are backward. His foss is smeared with ash, and he just blessed the crowd by sticking out his tongue and mooning the altar. Welcome to the Feast of Fools, one of the most outrageous spectacles ever tolerated by the medieval church, held every year around the New Year, particularly in France. The Feast of Fools was a sanctioned explosion of disorder. The idea was simple. Take the most rigid institution in medieval Europe of the church and turn it inside out for a day. Choir boys dressed as clergy. The low-ranking deacons elected a fool bishop or lord of misrule. Hope presided over mock masses filled with parody, flatulence, and sometimes literal barnyard animals. Imagine Theogen becoming CEO for 24 hours and doing everything backward, blindfolded and wasted. That's the level of absurdity we're talking about. But here's the wildest part. The church didn't just allow this, they hosted it. In fact, the festivities were often organized by cathedral chapters themselves. Why? Because the rigid social hierarchy needed a pressure valve. Life in medieval France was suffocating. Peasants obeyed landlords, clergy obeyed bishops, and everyone obeyed God, or else the Feast of Fools it was their one legal chance to scream, laugh, and mock everything that oppressed them. It was like Mardi Gras meets an exorcism. Participants paraded through the streets wearing masks, playing lutes, singing lewd songs, and shouting blasphemies with the gleeful immunity of jesters. Sometimes they even rode donkeys into churches. Holy water was replaced with wine. Sermons were rewritten as body poems. The air smelled of ale and candle wax and chaos. But it wasn't just silly fun. It was social satire in disguise. The spit knew exactly who they were mocking. The elites who ruled them from ivory towers and golden thrones. And for just one day, the joke was finally on them. The result, holy anarchy, sung in perfect choirboy harmony. Every kingdom needs a ruler, even one built on chaos. And during the Feast of Fools, that ruler wasn't a king, bishop, or baron. It was the Lord of Misrule, a crown-wearing court jester, elected from the lowest ranks of the clergy. or, sometimes, even the town's most absurd drunkard. Picture this: a gangly teenager from the cathedral choir, barely able to grow a beard, is suddenly paraded through town on a makeshift throne made of beer barrels. He's wearing oversized bishop robes and a mitre, crafted from pigskin, and he blesses the crowd by flinging cabbage anthem. This is no joke. This was tradition. The Lord of Misrule was Thelevine embodiment of reversal. Everything serious became far, everything sacred profane. He would ever see fake processions, reverse rituals, and outrageous parodies of Christian rites. The gospel was read backward. Incense was replaced with smoke from burnt shoes, and in place of holy chants, participants howled, snorted, and even meowed like cats. The people loved it. He had full command of the town for the day, leading mock ceremonies and satirical sermons that would make a modern-day stand-up comic. His court included other clowns, jugglers, and disorderly clergy who may or may not have been completely sober. They handed out fake indulgences, held drunken trials, and sometimes staged mock excommunications of authority figures, all with roaring applause. What made this dangerous and thrilling was how close it danced to blasphemy, but that was the point. This wasn't mindless chaos. In fact, the choice of a low-ranking youth or peasant as the ruler wasn't accidental. It was a satirical jab at the divine right of kings and the sanctity of bishops. By electing someone absurd, the people weren't just laughing. They were how ridiculous the real power structures could be. If a choir boy could wear the robes and mimic Thessermans, how divine were they really? Church authorities often tried to suppress the festival's worst excesses, but never quite succeeded. The Lord of Misrule kept returning year after year, drunker and louder than ever, because as long as society had rigid rules, the people would crave a day to break them. You walk into a cathedral expecting solemn hymns and stern faces. Instead, you're greeted by a man in a donkey mask braying from the pulpit. Welcome to the heart of the Feast of Fools, where the sacred space became a stage, and no line was too bold to cross. During the height of the festival, actual church interiors, those awe-inspiring echoing vaults, were verticon by rockers' parody, not just outside in the town square, but right inside the belly of Christendom. The choir boys danced, the canons shouted obscene jokes, processions fettered participants, dressed as women, animals, and even demons. It was Devon Theatre in full collapse. But the most iconic spectacle, the Ass Mass, where a donkey was led into the cathedral and allowed to bray at key moments in the service, and sometimes even answered the priest's lines. At the conclusion, instead, O Phaeton, the congregation would cry, hey-ha, hey-ho, in perfect unison. It sounds absurd because it was. But these acts had a biting undertone. They weren't just mocking the rituals. They were mocking the rigidity, hypocrisy, and self-importance of that church's hierarchy. The people knew the rules, and that's what made breaking them so satisfying. Priests and bishops were often torn. Some leaned into the joke, allowing the madness to play out in hopes it would burn itself out. Others were furious, trying desperately to stamp it out, condemning it as heretical and indecent. Papal bulls were assumed. Bishops wrote angry letters, and laws were passed to restrict the abuses, and yet it kept happening. Why? Because the cathedral wasn't just a holy place, it was the beating heart of the town. the one place everyone had to take seriously every other day of the year. Turning it into a carnival ground wasn't just fun, it was liberation for one wild day. The stone walls that symbolized divine authority became Theba backdrop for fart jokes and beer-soaked pageantry. Even the clergy couldn't help but laugh sometimes, because when your daily life is drenched in fear of sin, confession, and eternal damnation, chance to bray like a donkey in God's house, that's priceless. What makes a joke funny in medieval France? Dressing up like a bishop and performing a mock exorcism on cheese, or preaching a sermon in gibberish Latin while wearing underpants on your head. During the Feast of Fools, humor wasn't just encouraged, it was weaponized, and its sharpest target was the very rituals that held society together. The parody was surgical. Participants knew the Mass by heart. They had to. After all, most of the performers were subdeacons, or choir boys. That meant they understood the liturgy well enough to twist it. The result was absurd, blasphemous, and hilariously accurate. They mimicked prayers with crude rhymes, turned psalms into drinking songs, and delivered sermons that praised gluttony, lust, or the holiness of wine. These weren't just jokes for the sake of laughter. They were thinly veiled commentaries on the growing disconnect between the clergy and the people. When a parody mass swapped incense for manure smoke, it wasn't just for shock, it was a critique. One notorious example involved a fake blessing of sausages during a mock Lent, complete with solemn chants and holy gestures. In another, a faux bishop blessed the crowd while urinating in a bucket hidden beneath his robes. Offensive, yes, but it made a point. If church claimed spiritual superiority but indulged in earthly vices, why not call it out? Mock relics were paraded through the streets. Chicken bones, boots, or pig's teeth, treated as sacred objects and venerated with exaggerated devotion. The participants were saying quite loudly, "We know what you're doing, and we can do it, too." To the average viewer, it was gut-busting. To the church, it was a crisis. Yet this mockery was also a form of participation. It proved that even in their rebellion, people remained deeply engaged with religious life. They cared enough to mock, and they mocked because they understood. It was a backhanded kind of devotion, a way to wrestle with divine authority, using laughter instead of obedience. But not everyone laughed. Church officials increasingly viewed these performances as spiritual poison, blurring the line between parody and heresy, and as centuries passed, their patience wore thin. Still, for those who performed it, the feast was more than mockery. It was medicine, laughter in the face of a system too rigid to bend. For a festival so outrageous, so vulgar, and so obviously unholy, you'd expect church to shut it down instantly, right? And yet, for centuries, they didn't. In fact, some of the very people who ranted about its wickedness on Sunday helped organize it on Monday. Why? Because the dirty secret of the Feast of Fools was this: the clergy needed it, too. Life inside the church wasn't just candles and scripture. It was grueling, joyless, and full of pressure. Many clerics entered the Ranxion, took vows of chastity and obedience, and spent their days reciting prayers, copying manuscripts, and maintaining rigid routines that could break the spirit. The Feast of Fools offered a rare release valve. For one day a year, even priests could throw off the suffocating robes of piety and let their hair down, sometimes literally. Many subdeacons and low-ranking churchmen were expected to participate. Some even looked forward to it. It was their moment. In the spotlight, where they could perform, entertain, and indulge without consequences. They parodied their superiors, mocked church politics, and ridiculed religious hypocrisy from the inside. The festival was irreverent, yes, but also the people who understood the church best were the ones turning it into a circus. And let's be honest, some bishops turned a blind eye because they enjoyed it. It was easier to allow a day of chaos than to deal with secrets, rebellions, or festering resentment. Better to laugh once a year than to crack under the weight of silence. There were even rules around how far the satire could go. Informal, of course, but understood. It was a game with unspoken limits. Push too hard, and you'd hear about it. But toe the line with cleverness, you'd get a wink and a mug of ale. Still, not everyone inside the church-approved reformist voices began to grow louder by the late Middle Ages, calling the festival an embarrassment to Christian dignity. Preachers thundered from pulpits that devils danced among thefels, and that the laughter echoing through cathedrals would someday be replaced with wails of damnation. But the truth lingered, whispered in cloisters and sacristies. Sometimes the ones who wore the cross bidet needed to wear a jester's cap by night just to stay sane. Outside the cathedral, the madness spilt into the streets. The feast offals wasn't just an inside joke for the clergy. It was a full-blown community revolt, dressed in comedy. Bakers stopped baking. Blacksmiths joined parades. Housewives turned into queens for a day. And every alley echoed with song, laughter, and the occasional drunken duel over who could burp the Lord's Prayer the loudest. Shops closed. Markets transformed into makeshift stages. People traded their work clothes for ridiculous costumes, clowns, demons, animals, or twisted versions of authority figures. Mock trials were held where the accused were charged with crimes like excessive seriousness or failure to dance. The punishment, a pie to the face, or being paraded around town wearing nothing but a bedsheet and a chicken on your head. And the people loved it because for most of the earth, average medieval person was crushed under taxes, famine, disease, and fever, present threat of eternal damnation. There was no escape from hardship except briefly during the feast. And while it looked like fun and games, something deeper was happening. The people were talking back. They were using humor as a weapon, laughter as rebellion, and absurdity as resistance. No one was safe. Kings, lords, even the Pope might be represented as a drunken puppet on a cart, dragged through the mud by giggling children. These were bold, even dangerous acts, but hidden behind a layer of comedy. Satire gaveth powerless a voice, and as long as it was wrapped in a joke, they could say what they really felt about those who ruled over them. Even children joined in. In some towns, they elected a boy bishop who would parade through the streets, with mock clergy trailing behind. This was more than cute. It was a direct challenge to the hierarchy. If a child could lead a procession, what made the actual bishop so special? Of course, local authorities grumbled. Some towns tried to limit the excess. The festival blurred every line, sacred and profane, ruler and ruled, real and ridiculous. For one glorious day, the world turned upside down, and nobody wanted it to end. It couldn't last forever. By the late Middle Ages, the Feast of Fools had attracted the attention of more than just local bishops and grumpy town officials. Now, the church hierarchy in Rome began to take a hard look at what was happening in its own sanctuaries, and they were not amused. You can imagine the horror in papal circles. Sacred cathedrals turned into wine-stained theaters, the Mass reduced to crude slapstick, and young clerics mooning altars in front of weeping statues of the Virgin Mary. The mockery had gone from tolerated to scandalous, and worst of all, it wasn't dying out. It was getting more creative. Popes begging, issuing bulls, condemning the festival, calling it sacrilegious, demonic, and a threat to Christian order. The most notable blow came in 1445, when the Church of Sens, one of the oldest and most prestigious archbishops in France, officially banned the feast. Other regions followed. Penalties were introduced for participants. Clergy caught mocking rituals could be Towns that allowed the celebration were warned they'd face excommunication, but the feast didn't go quietly. Even as formal bans were issued and underground versions flourished, people just moved celebration into back alleys, private homes, or disguised it as a different holiday. The spirit of Thefist lived on in other festivals like the Carnival and Mardi Gras, where masks, satire, and mock authority remained central themes. And let's be honest, the church didn't just kill the feast because it was offensive. They killed it because it was dangerous. When peasants mock priests and choir parody bishops, it blurs the line between reverence and rebellion. Laughter may seem harmless, but in a rigid world, it's a weapon. It pokes holes in the sacred aura of power. And once you've laughed at something, it's hard to fear it the same way ever again. By the 1600s, the Feast of Fools had largely disappeared from official calendars. It was no longer blessed, no longer sanctioned, no longer safe, but its legacy lingered. The masks, the chaos, the laughter, all of it would reappear in different forms, because you can't suppress a festival. You can ban a tradition, but you can't kill the idea that sometimes the fool sees the truth more clearly than the priest. So the church cracked down. The cathedrals fell silent, and the Feast of Fools faded from public record. But if you think the spirit of the festival died out, think again. The fool just changed his costume. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the feasts energized into new corners of culture: theater, carnival, satire, and masquerade. In fact, if you've ever seen a Mardi Gras parade or watched a Shakespeare play where the court jester speaks truth to power, you're seeing the long shadow of the Feast of Fools. The medieval fool wasn't just a clown. He was a symbol of inversion, a walking critique of the establishment. He said the unsayable, mocked the untouchable, and danced in the face of solemnity. That tradition lived on, no longer inside churches, but in taverns, town squares, and traveling troupes. Even the church, ironically, borrowed from the fool's toolbox. Jesuit plays and morality dramas started using humor, irony, and role reversal to teach spiritual lessons. The same tools once used to ridicule the Mass were now being reabsorbed to strengthen it. Funny how that works. Meanwhile, in secular Europe, the carnivalesque became a cultural force. Writers like Rabelais, with his grotesque humor and upside-down worlds, carried forward the feast's irreverence. Court jesters continued to masquerade balls let nobles pretend to be beggars, and beggars pretend to be gods, if only for one night. In this way, the feast didn't vanish. It decentralized. It splintered into dozens of traditions, each carrying a sliver of that old madness. The laughter moved from the altar to the stage. The masks moved from cathedral-style carnivals, and the message question power, laugh at pomp, invert the world, remained intact. It also had a more subversive legacy. During revolutions in France and beyond, satire became a political weapon again. Songs, cartoons, and performances mocked kings and clergy, just like the fools once did in the nave of Notre Dame. The fool may have traded his donkey for a printing press, but he was still whispering rebellion behind his grin, because the feast of fools wasn't just a holiday. It was an idea that laughter can be sacred, mockery can be meaningful, and for one day, just one day, the world doesn't have to make sense. The Feast of Fools may be buried in history books now, but its message echoes across centuries. There is power in the absurd. For one brief, gleeful day, the mighty were mocked, the sacred was spoofed, and the powerless seized control, not with swords, but with laughter. It wasn't just a party. It was an inversion of the entire medieval worldview. In a time when hierarchy was divine, when everyone had a place, king, bishop, peasant, priest, and feast asked a dangerous question. What if the whole system was a joke? What if the bishop's hat looked better on a donkey? What if the peasants made better popes? Of course, the very reason the feast worked was because it ended. Everyone knew the clock would strike midnight, the robes would come off, and the fools would go back to sweeping floors. But that temporary rupture in the fabric of reality made everything else more bearable. It was a kind of spiritual release valve, a sanctioned bit of madness that kept the wider madness of daily life from boiling over. In modern times, we've inherited that spirit without realizing it. Every April Fool's Day prank, every stand-up comic taking shots at politicians, every carnival folk mocking the powerful, they all owe a debt to those rowdy French clerics braying in cathedrals. Even in digital culture, the legacy lives on. Memes, parody accounts, and viral videos mock CEOs, governments, and billionaires. These are the spiritual descendants of the feast. Different tools, same impulse, same laughter. Because sometimes the only way to survive a world built on power, fear, and control is to turn it upside down, to laugh in the face of authority, to make fun of what we're told we must revere. And that's what the Feast of Fools gave medieval Europe. A reminder that kings are mortal, bishops are rehuman, and nothing is too sacred to be laughed at. In the end, the fool was never just a clown. He was a mirror held up to the face of power. And for one nun, that glorious, chaotic, wine-soaked day every year, the world looked in that mirror and saw the truth. Not holy, not perfect, just human. An invitation sealed with the papal crest delivered by a liveried servant on horseback. You've been summoned to dine with His Holiness Pope Alexander VI, head of the Catholic Church and patriarch of the infamous the Borger family. It's not just a dinner. It's the dinner, and everyone who matters will be there. Diplomats, merchants, noblemen, cardinals, and maybe a few hired assassins, pretending to be poets. You dress carefully, wondering if this is your rise or your ruin. Because a Borger banquet wasn't just a meal, it was a stage. Behind the wine, the music, and the silk-draped tables was a swirling storm of ambition, lust, and blood. Every toast had a hidden motive. Every smile was laced with calculation, and every guest knew somewhere, in the back of their mind, that the wrong worder, the wrong goblet, could be the end. The stories surrounding these banquets are the stuff of legend. Some say Pope Alexander dined beneath fresco of naked gods, while musicians played suggestive madrigals, and Lucretia Borgia, draped in jewels, flashed flirtatious glances at rival kings. Others whisper about secret doors, hidden passages, and servants trained not only in etiquette, but also in silence. And then there's the poison. Ah, the poison. If you listened to the gossip that flowed through Rome like sewage, you'd hear of poison, rings, slipped powders, and wine that tasted faintly of almonds. Some swore that Caesar Borgia, the Pope's charming but brutal son, carried a flask of Conarella, a legendary slow-acting like a toxin, ready to dispatch rivals during the desert. Was it true, or just propaganda spun by jealous enemies? Hard to say. But here's the terrifying part. No one could be sure. And that uncertainty that was the Borgia genius, they cultivated an aura of menace wrapped in velvet. A guest might dine on pheasants stuffed with truffles while locking eyes with the man who ordered their cousin's murder. And Iberian smiled, because refusing an invitation from the Boers was more dangerous than accepting it. A boudoir banquet wasn't simply hosted. Every course, every candle, every flute of wine was meticulous lichen to overwhelm the senses and blur the line between admiration and intimidation. These were not meals. They were performances of power, meant to dazzle the eye, seduce the mind, and quietly remind guests exactly who ran Rome. Start with the setting. Highest ceiling halls dripping with tapestries, the floors scattered with rose petals, and tables set with golden encrusted plates that once belonged to defeated kings. Perfumed air wafted through the room, heavy with incense, myrrh, and the spiced aroma of meat slow roasted for hours. The light wasn't from torches. It came from chandeliers lined with Venetian glass, casting a warm, otherworldly glow over everything. And the food was obscene. Boars stuffed with pheasants, pheasants stuffed with figs and almonds, figs soaked in honey and imported cinnamon, entire ships of oysters hauled in from the coast, still fresh enough to twitch on the tongue. Dishes were stacked high, not to be eaten, but to be admired, like art. Wasn't gluttony for gluttony's sake. It was strategy. By feeding their guests like gods, the Borgias controlled them. No one is ready for war when their stomach is full of roasted crane and candied citrus. And the wine, oh, the wine. It flowed from fountains chilled with snow, brought down from the Apennines, served in goblets etched with the Buia bull. Waiters, your glass before you realized it was empty. Toasts rang out, Constantolito, the Pope, to Rome, to beauty, to peace. But behind the raised cups, ice watched, who drank, who hesitated, who paled after that third sip. Musicians played throughout, lutes, harps, and drums. Sometimes entire choirs were hidden behind curtains. Their voices rose like ghosts during desert. Dancers perfumed in near-transparent gowns, drawing blushing applause from cardinals. Jugglers tossed flaming knives. Fire-breathers sent sparks up into the vaulted ceiling. Everything had a double meaning. Every extravagance whispered, we have the wealth, the influence, the pleasure, and the poison. Sit, eat, enjoy. And so you did. Because to refuse their hospitality was an insult, but to enjoy it, that could be dangerous too. At the heart of every Bura feast sat a vision draped in silk and scandal. Lucitia Buia, beautiful, brilliant, and endlessly controversial. She was more than just the Pope's daughter. She was the hostess of Rome's most infamous affairs, with golden hair, soft smiles, and an intellect as sharp as any dagger in her brother's sleeve. Lucretia wasn't there to decorate the table. She owned it. She owned it. Guests adored her or feared her, often both. Her presence turned any meal into theater. She would glide between diplomats and dukes with the ease of a practiced politician, offering compliments that cut like glass and laughter that made even the most guarded men lean in. Her dress would shimmer with gold thread, her neckline daring, and her words always deliberate. Everything she did was a calculated performance. Some said her charm was supernatural. Others whispered that she was a pawn, used by her father and brother as bait in their deadly political games. But those who watched her closely at these banquets saw something different. Control. Lucrezia knew exactly how to command attention, disarm suspicion, and shift the balance of power, sometimes with a single toast. She toasted often, and people drank. That was the problem. Thestories, of course, followed her like a perfume trail. Guests who flirted too boldly or asked too many questions were said to fall mysteriously ill days later. Lucrezia was rumored to wear a hollow ring filled with powdered poison which she could tip into a goblet with a gentle flick of the wrist. Truth or fiction, the beauty of her presence was that no one could tell, and that uncertainty made her even more dangerous. At one banquet, it said, she recited a love poem while staring directly at a visiting ambassador, whose sudden death days later set off a minor diplomatic crisis. The Borgiers claimed illness. Rome whispered murder, but still they came. Everyone did, because missing a banquet hosted by Lucrezia Borgia meant missing the very center of power and possibly insulting a woman who could turn a smile into a sentence. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had the room in the palm of her poisoned hand. While Lucretia played the siren at the Hedel, Caesarborger lingered in the shadows, watching, measuring, and planning. He didn't need to smile. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone could silence a room. And at every banquet, whether seated beside his father or stalking the edges of the crowd, Caesar was the one everyone truly feared, dressed in black velvet, with gold trim and a sword that was more than ornamental. Caesar radiated menace. His movements were smooth, practiced, and calculated. He could toast a foreign duke and slip a threat into the conversation without ever raising his voice. And the way guests responded, laughing too hard, sweating too much, glancing nervously at their wine, made it clear they knew exactly who they were dining with. These banquets weren't just for show. For Caesar, they were intelligence operations. He observed alliances form and crumble over a shared platter of roasted lamb. He tested loyalties with offhand remarks and gauged the ambitions of minor nobles. With a single raised brow, his enemies made mistakes under the influence of wine and music. Caesar remembered every one of them. There was, of course, a guest west, whispering rebellion, and was found in the Tiber the next morning. A noblewoman who refused his advances and was promptly married off to a cousin with a hunting accident reputation. Coincidence, perhaps. But around Chur, coincidence felt like strategy. At one infamous banquet, Cheshire reportedly orchestrated the seating chart to place two rival envoys side by side. then watched them nearly come to blows over a spilt goblet. As they bickered, he made his move, signing a secret treaty with a third guest across the room. By dessert, one was disgraced, one was exiled. Anger had gained a fortress. He preferred action to words, but when he did speak, it mattered. A quiet nod from Cheshire could signal a shift in a political alliance or the delivery of poison. You never knew. And that was the point, because at a boar banquet, the danger wasn't in the food. It was in the man watching you eat it. Among all that haunted the boar banquets, one refused to die. Poison, elegant, silent, and utterly deniable. Poison was said to be the family's favorite dish, served with charm, swallowed with compliments, and discovered far too late. If you were unlucky enough to receive an invitation to dine, the first rule was simple: watch your wine. Whispers of secret toxin known as cantarella filled the streets of Rome, supposedly black, odious, and laced with arsenic. It could be slipped into a goblet without altering the taste. Victims didn't clutch their throats or fall over during dessert. No, they would leave the banquet smiling, then collapsing a day or two later, groaning in agony as their insides burned. It was the perfect crime, untraceable and delayed. And who was blamed? Often no one, or if suspicions were raised. There was never proof, just rumors, convenient deaths, strategic timing. Stories abounded. A cardinal who blocked the Pope's plans did, after sipping wine from a silver chalice. A rival banker who challenged Caesar's financing vanished after a dinner toast. One nobleman, terrified of bourgeois hospitality, brought his own food taster, who, according to legend, dropped dead before the main course. Were Thestals exaggerated? Perhaps. But that's the genius of fear. You only need to believe it might be true. Even the serving vessels were suspect. It was said that Lucia wore a hollow ring capable of releasing powdered poison with the flick of a wrist. Others believed Cheshire carried a diamond-studded flask filled with liquid death, always within reach. Whether fact or fiction, the rumors gave the family power. Guests who feared the poison were just as controllable as those who were actually poisoned. Because poison didn't just kill, it silenced dissent. It made people compliant, nervous, easily manipulated, and, most terrifying of all, it made every glass of wine a gamble. You couldn't refuse a drink. That would be an insult. You couldn't show fear. That would mark you as weak. So, you toasted, smiled, and prayed that your name wasn't already crossed out in some shadowy bourgeois ledger. Because at these banquets, it wasn't just about who had the sharpest tongue or the grandest gift. It was about who lived to tell the tale. If there's one bourgeois banquet, thatcherly burnt itself into the scandalized memory of Europe. It was the night of the banquet of chestnuts, a gathering so depraved, so theatrically obscene, that even Rome blushed. Held in October of 1501, within the private chambers of the Vatican, it was not just a dinner. It was a spectacle of calculated debauchery, orchestrated by Cheshire and sanctioned, if not delighted in, by his father Pope Alexander VI. Contemporary sources, including the often-quoted diarist Johann Burchard, described the event in shocking detail. 50 courtesans, hand-picked for their beauty, were brought into the hall and instructed to undress. As the evening progressed, their task to retrieve chestnuts scattered across the flourishing only their mouths. The watching guests, many of them clergy, and nobility sat atop velvet cushions with goblets of wine in hand, tossing coins and insults in equal measure. Pfeffler glittered with candle-lightened sign. Food was served as the entertainment unfolded. Whole roast pigs, glazed fruits, and spiced custards all passed around as the room descended into something more orgy than feast. But this wasn't mindless indulgence, not for the bores. It was a performance offer, a deliberate breaking of every moral and religious law within the very walls of the papal court. The message was clear. We answer to no one, not the church, not God, not Rome. Cheshire allegedly handed out prizes to the men who performed best that night, measuring virility like a battlefield. Valor. Lucretia's involvement is debated. Some say she watched, others claim she orchestrated part of it. Still, others suggest she wasn't even present, but the association was enough to blacken her name for generations. Many historians argue the event was exaggerated, twisted by enemies eager to smear the Borgia name, and perhaps it was. But the very fact that such stories could be believed about a pope and Hildrun tells you everything about the reputation they had built. Because even if only half of it were true, the banquet of chestnuts wasn't just a party. It was a warning. At a boo feast, pleasure was power, spectacle was politics, and no vice was too great to be paraded in the open, especially when the Pope himself was applauding. Behind the silken curtains and overflowing wine cups, there's something even more chilling about the Bura banquets. They took place in the heart of the Vatican, not in some distant palace, not in a private villa hidden from judgment, but in the sacred halls of the papal court, where cardinals prayed by day, they feasted by night, where saints were honored in marble, sinners danced beneath chandeliers. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, understood one thing better than any of his predecessors. Appearances were everything. So he made sure his were unforgettable. The feasts he held were not just indulgent. They were designed to blur lines between the holy and the profane, to test the limits of papal power. If he could turn the Vatican into a theater of excess and still wear the keys of St. Peter, then who could challenge him? Banquets spilt across frescoed corridors, echoing through chapels and courtyards. Religious paintings looked down on overflowing platters and bare-shouldered courtesans. Cardinals dined next to poets, spies, and mercenaries. The church's most sacred space became a piece of domination, a visual reminder that under Alexander's rule, nothing was sacred but his will. Even foreign envoys were drawn into the act. The banquets became diplomatic traps, occasions for watching, listening, and manipulating. A single raised eyebrow from Cheshire, or a soft murmur from Lucetia during dinner could shape the outcome of entire wars, and all of it happened beneath the glowing ceilings of the Apostolic Palace. Many outside the Vatican were horrified. Reformist voices, already rising across Europe, seized on the rumors like wildfire. How could the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, preside over orgies and murder masked as feasting? How could God's house smell off-roasted game and perfume? But that was the Borg gamble. Rule sutragiously, so visibly that no one dared call your bluff, and for a while it worked until it didn't. Because even the most dazzling feast must eventually end. The candles gutter, the guests depart, the wine runs dry. And in Thessalon's that follows, the world begins to ask, what did we just witness? A celebration of power, or its final desperate performance? There was always a strange tension at Boria. Banquets beneath the flattery and laughter, behind the velvet curtains and golden goblets, because everyone knew that some guests didn't leave, at least not the way they came in. It was the unspoken rule of every Boo gathering. What happened at the table could change your future or end it entirely. Sometimes a guest would arrive, full of swagger, convinced they were untouchable, a rival noble, a troublesome cardinal, a merchant who had crossed Cheshire in negotiations. They'd be seated prominently, toasted graciously, and fed like royalty, and then nothing, no violence, no scandal, just absence. A few days later, news would spread. They'd fallen ill, or vanished, or drowned in a canal. Rome learned quickly that an invitation from the bourgeois was both a compliment and a threat. Some of the disappearances were subtle. A young noblewoman, critical of Lucretia, was last seen dancing at a Vatican feast. Her estate passed quietly to a family ally, the Spanish. Envoy loudly opposed to Alexander's papacy died peacefully in his sleep the night after attending a banquet. When his body was examined unofficially, his lips were black, others were more dramatic. One diplomat was said to have collapsed during dessert, face first into his plate of candied quince. The room froze. Jess reportedly stood side and said, "Remove him. He has lost his appetite." Were all of these deaths truly orchestrated? It's hard to say. The Borgias had enemies eager to smear them, and every unexplained illness became part of the legend. But that legend had power because it wasn't the actual deaths that gave the banquets their reputation. It was the possibility that every guest knew they were being watched. Every toast carried risk. Every mouthful of food might be the last. The psychological pressure was immense, and that was the point. Even if the poison wasn't real, the fear was. And fear is a weapon more effective than any dagger. So they smiled, they laughed, they clinked glasses and praised the hosts. And deep down they wondered, had they said too much, offended the wrong person, seated a little too close to Lucitia? Because once you entered a Bora banquet, you were no longer a guest, you were a piece on the board. Like all banquets, Burge feasts eventually came to an end, but not with a toast, not with applause, with whispers, accusations, collapse. By the early 1500s, the grandeur had begun to rot from within. Pope Alexander V was aging, QI, once unstoppable, was growing reckless, and the enemies they had toyed with for years were no longer content to play the game. The nerves were out. Alexander died suddenly in 1503. Ironically, some say it was from poisoned wine meant for someone else. According to Toromor, both he and Chari fell ill after a shared meal, likely at one of their own banquets. The irony was, exquisite, the hunter, undone by his own methods, Chur survived, but was never the same. His power crumbled, his allies turned, and he died a few years later in exile, bloody, broken, and far from the table where he once reigned like a prince of shadows. Lucretia curiously endured. She left Rome, married into nobility, and transformed into a respected duchess. Some say she repented. Others believed simply learnt how to hide her game better than her brothers. But the banquets, their true legacy, outlived them all. They became myth. Horror stories whispered in candlelit taverns. Cautionary tales told by diplomats. Inspiration for novels, operas, event television. Centuries later, the image of a poisoned cup, a smiling pope, a chestnut's strewn floor. It never quite left the Western imagination, because the Borger banquets weren't just about indulgence. They were a metaphor, a feast where pleasure masked danger, where every bite could be betrayal, and where power was never served without a cost. The table was the battlefield, the courses, the strategy, the guests, players, or pawns. And in a way, the world never stopped imitating them. Political dinners, state banquets, backroom deals over champagne and caviar. These are the descendants of the boar feast. The poison's more discreet now, but the tension is still very much alive. So, the next time you're at a lavish table, surrounded by smiles, flattery, and clinking glasses, ask yourself, who's actually in charge here? And more importantly, what's really in your wine? Imagine a world without jails, police, or iron-fisted kings. A world where the law didn't come from a distant throne, but from the soil beneath your feet and the clan at your back. This was early medieval Ireland, a land ruled not by empires, but by kinship, and in this intricate web of tribal loyalty, justice had a name, Brehon law, for over 1,000 years. Long before the English crown arrived with parchment and prisons, Brehon law governed Iceland with quiet resilience. It wasn't written in a statute book or enforced by sheriffs with swords. It was oral, flexible, and deeply rooted in community and honor. There were no executions, no life sentences. Crime wasn't just an offense against the state. It was a tear in the fabric of society. And that tear had to be mended, not punished. Let's say a man broke another's arm in a fight. Under feudal law, he'd be thrown in a dungeon, or worse. Under Brehon law, he'd owe an honor price, a carefully calculated payment in cattle, silver, or goods, determined by the victim's rank, reputation, and injury. The goal wasn't to inflict pain. It was to restore balance, to make the injured party whole again, and allow the community to move forward without spiraling into revenge. This legal code did not serve kings, it served clans. Every individual was tied to a king group, and that group was responsible for their actions. If a man couldn't pay his fine, his family paid it. If someone committed a crime, the victim's family had a right to seek compensation, not blood. It was law shaped for a world where people lived side by side, generation after generation. You couldn't just eliminate your enemies. You had to learn to live with them. At its core, Brehon law wasn't about dominance. It was about coexistence. It recognized that in a tight-knit, honor-bound society, maintaining peace was more valuable than flexing power. Justice wasn't a cold decree. It was a communal negotiation, a balancing act designed to keep the tribe whole. This was justice by consensus, law without a gavel, a system not of punishment, but of reckoning and repair. And for centuries it worked. In a land without courses, you didn't take your case to a judge. You took it to a Brian. And no, Abraham didn't wear robes, pound gavels, or shout order in the court. These were not enforcers. They were interpreters, mediators, and guardians of memory. Because for most of Irish history, the law wasn't written down. It was memorized and passed orally through generations of trained legal scholars. Brehons were chosen from elite legal families and trained from a young age. Think of them like living libraries. A Brehon could recite centuries-old cases, law from memory, quoting precedent with poetic cadence. Their job wasn't to impose punishment. Their job was to restore harmony, to weigh competing claims, trace genealogies, calculate restitution, and recommend a fair solution. It was law as storytelling, and these were storytellers, trusted to speak truth in tense moments. But there's a twist. Branches had no authority to enforce their rulings. They couldn't summon warriors or levy fines by force. Their power entirely on trust. Simple as that. This created a legal culture based on reputation, not coercion. A bronze scradibity was everything. Their rulings had to be persuasive, balanced, and fair, because there were always other bruns. If one seemed biased or corrupt, a disputing party could take their case elsewhere. This competition kept the system honest, and it wasn't just the elite who had access to them. Poets, farmers, craftsmen, everyone had the right to seek out a bargain. The law was complex, yes, but it was shared. It belonged to the community, not to a bureaucratic elite. If you could argue your case well, or had someone argue it for you, you had a chance. Over time, some Bransons became celebrities. Their names appear in Irish poetry and legend. They were revered not for power, but for wisdom, for finding peace where others saw only conflict. So, in a world of feuding clans and fragile alliances, the Bran stood as a living bridge, not between guilt and punishment, but between families, between egos, between chaos and consensus. They weren't feared, they were respected. Imagine a legal system with no jails, no shackles, no gallows looming in the town square. In medieval Ireland, there were no prison cells because Brehon law didn't believe in locking people away. Justice wasn't about punishing the body, it was about healing the wound between people, families, and communities. If someone committed a crime under Brehon law, the focus wasn't on vengeance, it was under restoration. What was broken had to be mended. If you stole cattle, you repaid the cattle plus interest. If you injured someone, you paid their honor price, a compensation based on their social standing and the severity of the injury. If you killed someone, their family received a blood fine, a carefully measured sum meant to acknowledge the loss and prevent further bloodshed. This wasn't forgiveness without consequence. It was justice designed for a society without a centralized state. There was no standing army, no police force. So instead, justice relied on the social pressure of clan ties and collective reputation. You could be ostracized, boycotted, or shunned, which in a tightly knit village could mean social death. Brehon law was about maintaining harmony in a world where feuds could spiral out of control. It recognized that revenge only fed more violence. So instead, eye for an eye, it built a system of measured repayment. A wrong was not erased, but acknowledged and balanced. The wound didn't vanish, but it was closed. It also meant that justice moved quickly. There were no endless trials, no years-long imprisonment. Disputes were heard, resolutions reached, and payments made. The goal wasn't to remove people from society. It was to keep them in it, accountable for their actions, but still part of the whole. And remarkably, it worked. For centuries, Ireland functioned under this restorative modellum before modern ideas of restorative justice would be discussed in courtrooms around the world. The Bryans understood something that modern systems still wrestle with. Justice isn't just about rules, it's about relationships. So while castles in Europe were building dungeons, the Irish built a legal system that asked not how can we punish the offender, but rather how do we restore the peace. In a world where most medieval legal systems treated women and the lower classes as afterthoughts or property, Bryan law stood apart. It wasn't modern, it wasn't perfect, but compared to feudal codes elsewhere in Europe, it was startlingly progressive. In Ireland, under Bryan's law, even thos without swords or titles had a voice and rights. Let's start with women. Unlike in MUCHOF, medieval Europe, Irish women under Bryan law could own property, inherit land, and divorce their husbands. A wife could reclaim her dowry if a marriage ended, and she wasn't automatically placed under her husband's control. If her husband mistreated her or simply didn't perform his domestic obligations, women could also enter into contracts, take disputes before a bourne, and have their honor price, the value placed on a person in legal compensation, calculated independently of their husband or father. In short, a woman had legal standing. That didn't mean complete equality, but it meant she was more than a footnote in someone else's legal narrative. And the law didn't stop at gender. It extended protections to artisans, poets, the poor, and even the disabled. Poets and bards, for instance, had specific honor prices based on their rank within the poetic tradition. A blind man could not be struck without serious legal consequences. The poor couldn't be fined beyond their means if they couldn't pay in cattle or silver. Arrangements might be made in labor or goods. Why so inclusive? Because Brehon law was based on balance and status within a tribe, not wealth or conquest. Everyone had a role, and that role came with responsibilities and protections. Even the seemingly powerless were still part of the equation. This wasn't about charity. It was about maintaining social harmony. If the weak were abused, the community fractured. Sud law gave them tools not to dominate, but to defend their dignity. In a time when justice elsewhere often meant might makes right, Brehon law offered a different vision. A legal system that didn't just ask who has power, but who belongs. And in early Ireland, the answer was everyone. In medieval Ireland, marriage was sealed with rings and church bells. It was negotiated like a business deal, often over a table, filled with ledgers, livestock, and lineage records. Under Brehon law, marriage was a contract, and like any good contract, it spelled out who owned what, who owed what, and crucially, what would happen if everything fell apart. Forget one size fits all. There were 10 different types of marriage in Bryan law, ranging from equal partnerships to temporary arrangements. Some unions were between social equals, where property was pooled and divided fairly if the couple split. Others were more unequal. Say, if a woman married into a wealthier clan, but still protected her personal property rights. A woman brought a coche, a bride price, and a dowry might follow. But she didn't lose everything to her husband upon marriage. If the relationship ended, both parties retained their original property. Anything acquired jointly was divided according to the terms of their union. That's right. Early medieval Iceland had prenup. A divorce might result in 15 cows going one way, 10 the other, and to being held as security against future disputes. Inheritance, too, was handled with care. Children from different marriages had claims, and legitimacy was often based more on public acknowledgement than church doctrine. But marriage wasn't just romantic, it was political. Clans used it to build alliances, forge peace, or consolidate land. The legal structure made sure these unions were more than just symbolic. They were binding contracts, enforceable under law with clear expectations and legal recourse. Consent was important, while arranged marriages were common. Forced marriages were not legally valid unless both parties agreed. A special alliance puberty was reached, and if either spouse was infertile, neglected the household, or committed persistent infidelity, the other could seek a legal dissolution. All of this was settled not by priests or kings, but by Bransons, who calculated the fairness of each case based on custom, social standing, and precedent. In Brecon law, your name was your currency. Literally, every individual had what was known as an honor price, a legal valuation of your social standing. It determined how much compensation you'd receive if someone wronged you and how much you'd owe if you wronged someone else. It wasn't based on wealth or land. It was based on status, role, and reputation. Think of it like a living credit score for your dignity. A chieftain had a high honor price. So did poets, brehons, and master craftsmen. A farmer or freeman had a more modest one, but it still mattered. If someone insulted you in public or struck you in anger, they owed you compensation equal to your honor price. And if you committed a crime, theft you paid was based not just on the harm caused, but on who you were and who your victim was. It was a deeply personalized justice system. No flat rates, no blanket sentences. It was legal tender. Protecting your reputation wasn't about vanity. It had real financial consequences. Gossip, slander, and public insults weren't just rude. They were actionable offenses. If someone called you a thief or questioned your lineage without proof, they could be forced to pay you in cattle, silver, or goods. And repeat offenders, they could see their own honor price reduced, a kind of social downgrade that made every future interaction more costly. This also made lying in legal disputes incredibly risky. If you gave false testimony and it was discovered, you didn't just lose face, you lost legal credibility, and that meant your honor price dropped. And with it, your ability to defend yourself, claim restitution, or participate in community agreements. But there was an upside, too. You could raise your honor price through service, loyalty, and contribution to your clan. A respected warrior, healer, or wise elder could elevate their legal worth simply by living honorably. In short, Brennan law turned justice into a moral economy. Your actions weren't judged by a faceless court. They echoed through your social world. Break trust, and it costs you. Keep your word, and it will pay. Because, in early Ireland, your good name was everything. To understand Bren law, you have to understand what people in early Ireland valued. Spoiler. It wasn't castles, coins, or crowns. The real power rested in land, cattle, and kinship. Three pillars that shaped every legal decision, contract, and judgment. In the Brehon world, land wasn't privatelium the way we think of it today. Instead, it was held collectively by the clan or fine. Families worked the land, passed it down through generations, and guarded it fiercely. Individual members had usage, rights, not ownership. So if you left the clan, you lost your access. This meant land wasn't just about agriculture, it was about belonging. Your legal standing was inseparable from your place in the tribe. Cattle, meanwhile, were currency, wealth, and livelihood all rolled into one. Everything from dowries to fines was measured in cows. Legal texts even recorded the value of specific types. 1 cow for a bruise, 5 for a broken bone, more for killing a prized bull. And it triggered automatic compensation. Every transaction, every legal settlement was designed to keep the community in balance. Cattle weren't hoarded, they circulated, acting as both restitution and alliance-building tools. And then there was kinship, fine visible thread. Under Brehon law, you were never alone. Your actions reflected on your family, and your family stood behind your debts. Disputes weren't just between individuals, they were clan-level negotiations. This collective accountability created a powerful incentive for good behavior. No one wanted to bring shame or debt on their people. At the same time, it meant justice was personal. You weren't just punished by the system, you were held accountable by your own blood. So when the Brehons judged a case, they didn't just ask what happened. They asked whose land was touched, whose cattle were harmed, and which clan now bears the weight of justice. It weighs about keeping the clan and the land whole. Under Brecon law, a crime wasn't just an act against the law. It was an imbalance in the social order. Theft, assault, and even homicide weren't just personal offenses. They disrupted the harmony of the clan and the community. And unlike the retributive systems of feudal Europe, Brian justice did come down like a hammer. It reached out like a scale. Theft, for example, wasn't punished by chopping off a hand. It was punished by repayment, often double or triple the value of what was taken. The idea was clear. Sheep didn't just risk your reputation, it risked theirs, too. Assault had its own codes. There were detailed charts laying out the value of every injury, from a black eye to a broken rib to the loss of a tooth. The honor price system applied here again, ensuring that compensation matched not only the damage, but the social status of the victim. Violence wasn't ignored, it was measured. Even that followed the principle of restoration over vengeance. The killer didn't face the gallows. Instead, their kin was obligated to pay the reich, or blood, fine, to the victim's family. It wasn't just a payout. It was a public admission of guilt. Because in a clan-based society, Feudskuld lasts for generations. One murder could spark a cycle of violence that swallowed entire families. Breen law offered another path. It asked, can peace be restored through compensation? Bree had two navigatet-angled family loyalties, political rivalries. Ta contain it, to absorb the shock of human failure, and root it through custom negotiation and compensation. In other words, it wasn't about punishment, it was about preserving peace. For over 1,000 years, Brehon law held Ireland together, not with canes or crowns, but with consensus, custom, and community. But by the late Middle Ages, that balance began to unravel. Centralized anarchy and a very different idea of what law should look like. When the Normans arrived in the 12th century, they brought feudal law, rigid, hierarchical, and based on royal authority, but dangerous. By the 17th century, Brehon law was formally outlawed. Brehons were stripped of their authority. Gaelic lords who clung to the old system were branded dribbles or traitors. English courts took over, imposing prisons, executions, and land seizures where once there had been cattle fines and clan negotiations. And yet, Brecon law didn't vanish overnight. In rural areas, especially in the west of Ireland, people continued to settle disputes the old way. Secret arbitration, community resolution, and honor-based compensation persisted in the shadows. Even as English judges wore wigs and wielded the king's justice, folk memory held tight to the idea that justice could be about balance, not domination. In modern times, Brian Lahus made a quiet comeback, not as a living system, but as an inspiration. Scholars study it, activists invoke it, restorative justice. Movements both in Ireland and abroad look to its principles of repair over revenge as a model for building better, more human legal systems. Because Brian law reminds us that justice isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about preserving relations, restoring dignity, and rebuilding trust. It tells us that law can be local. Courts, the wisdom of early Ireland has something to say.